brought up to think of history as a series of dates, monarchs and battles, usually won by the English, of course, often think of the subject merely as something in the school curriculum or as a fruitful source of plots for body strippers and Hollywood films. But of course, history is far more than that. Why do we need to know about it? What can we learn from the past? Andrew Roberts is a professional historian.
In order to become true democrats and to take part in the full working of our parliamentary democracy, you have to have a way of looking at a problem which incorporates the past, incorporates the way in which it was worked on before by others. If you look at the three great issues facing us today, the Irish question with regard to the peace negotiations going on there, the European issue and how far Britain should integrate closer into the European community, and the whole question of the Balkans war and the terrible slaughter that's taking place at the moment in former Yugoslavia, each of these problems have their roots back in the 19th century, and unless one reads about the 19th century, understands where they come from, how can you possibly understand what people are fighting and dying for today?
In many parts of the world, history is as much about today's politics as about yesterday's events. The conflicts of the present feed on the battles of the past. Moreover, some of today's conflicts turn on rival views of the events that happened a long time ago. The lands of the former Soviet Union have always produced, to paraphrase Saki, more history than they can consume locally. Now that they're released from the communist yoke, they're busily constructing new histories out of old memories, often as gory as they're glorious. The English, more than their Celtic neighbours, have tended to take a dispassionate view of history. They frequently think of it as the rational analysis of past events, an attempt to impose retrospective order on the jumble of former centuries. But can history ever be studied dispassionately? Indeed, should it be? Does Raphael Samuel, who teaches history at Ruskin College, Oxford, think it wrong to use history for social and political ends?
History is going to be used for social and political ends, is always being used for social and political ends, whether we like it or not. I don't think there is, as it were, a right way in which it can be used. The one thing we can do as historians or as critical historians is to observe, to warn people, if you like, of how it's being used and to point out that there are other kind of truths which this is necessarily suppressing. No history is innocent of politics, and that's not a matter of whether it should or shouldn't be. It simply is the case, and the history that claims that it's politically neutral is as much a creature of politics as any other.
But the idea that history is always contaminated by politics is not one to accept calmly. It begs questions about whether those politics are unifying or divisive, benign or malign. It also implies that history will always be a battleground, fought over by politicians as much as by academics. Certainly a tussle has been taking place even in England, where the development of the national curriculum has led to a furious row about what children should learn and how, and whether politicians should take such a decision. Faced with such passions, should we simply stick to the facts? Alas, historians don't always agree even on them. Juliana Delaney is marketing manager for Heritage Projects, which runs several historical attractions around the country, including the Jorvik Centre at York. Her experience is that ordinary people long to feel that what they're seeing is historically accurate, but her experience of historians has sometimes been disappointing.
You have to recognise that at times even the academics don't agree. We've had situations where a number of advisors have given us conflicting information. A simple fact about the roofing material used on dwellings in Viking Age York. Nobody could actually agree on what the material would have been. And if they can't agree on something as simple as that, then I'm sure that there will be other facts that they will disagree on too. One then has to take the very best information available and use that. The most dangerous thing is to invent it, because then it would be distorting the past, which would have a detrimental effect on our view of the future.
But doesn't the past, in a sense, distort itself? A great deal of selection has already gone on even before a historian starts to look for evidence. Some eras, think of the Romans, leave rich scenes of evidence behind them. Others, like the Vikings, leave only tantalizing fragments. Men have left more records than their wives and daughters, the rich more than the poor, the conquerors more than the conquered. Such selections inevitably shape our view of what happened. But so does the evidence we look for and the point of view from which we see it. That may change from one generation to the next. Andrew Roberts is the author of Eminent Churchillians, a book that aims to shake the pedestals of some of Britain's wartime leaders. Does he think that the passage of time has affected Britain's view of the past?
I think that the way in which Britain sees its past has altered a lot since the Second World War. In 1945, teachers in schools and universities would have, by and large, assumed that the history of the previous century, specifically looking at imperialism and what Britain did for the world, was overall a very good thing. Today, you will not find even the most jingoistic traditionalist arguing that the British Empire was always a good thing for everybody in all circumstances, which was the assumption. Equally, however, you won't find today anybody saying, for example, that communism was good for Russia. That would not have been the case in 1945. History is a constant debate, it's always moving, and that's one of the reasons it's so exciting.
The excitement of history for anybody is partly that it's an argument about the past rather than, or as well as, a record of it.
Raphael Samuel.
There aren't fixed points because if you go back to the Tudor almanacs, you'll see the capture of Boulogne in 1544 by Henry VIII was the greatest event in English history after the Norman Conquest, and it's forgotten now. Or the capture of Mallorca in, I think it's 1787, which was a tremendous kind of national event, which has disappeared down a memory hole. So I think there aren't, in that way, fixed points. I mean, after all, Boadicea, who's been a very inspiring figure for many English people from the late 19th century, disappears from the record for more than 1,000 years. She's rediscovered or reinvented in the 1590s. So even if you take kind of the greatest figures, they're absolutely not fixed. I mean, what's interesting is the way they're remade and reconstructed in each epoch. I mean, the history is always a child of its time.
Does it matter that some historical events disappear down a memory hole? It certainly bears out the Russian saying that the past is unpredictable. In fact, what we choose to forget, or to remember, may say more about the way we want to see ourselves than about what really happened. The Victorians delved into the Middle Ages, not because Sir Walter Scott had rediscovered and romanticised them, but because they wanted to remember the world the way it was before the Industrial Revolution came along and spoilt it. But history isn't just a child of its time, it's also a child of its country. Think, for instance, of the generations of British schoolchildren who have wondered why, if the English won so many glorious victories in medieval France, they still lost all their French territories. Our nationality affects our view of the past far more than most of us realise. Maitland Stobart may be an exception because, as Deputy Director of Education and Culture in the Council of Europe, he is based in Strasbourg.
I've lived a long time in France. When I first went to France as a postgraduate student, and I was discussing with other students our history of France and Britain, and we started talking about Dunkirk. Now, for me, I'd never challenged this. For me, Dunkirk, the heroic defeat, a sort of victory, the thing the British are very good at times. And then I was suddenly attacked by several of the French students there by saying that this was a typical example of the British fighting, as usual, to the last Frenchman, and that it was a shameful betrayal. And I think that one has to be aware that events in one's history, the perceptions are not shared, but one has to be aware of them.
Most British people would be aghast to be told that Dunkirk was a shameful betrayal rather than a courageous defeat. Indeed, the very idea that there may be more than one way of looking at the same past event is something relatively new. It wouldn't have occurred to the Victorians, for instance. Even today, there are many parts of the world where the existence of a single historical truth is taken for granted. In the Soviet Union, history was taught as a set of established facts with a single interpretation, one, of course, that explained the triumph of communism. The idea that there may be several histories, all equally valid, is behind the argument that's raged in Britain over the national curriculum. At one level, the argument has been a familiar one about traditional versus newfangled teaching methods. Should children be taught history in chronological order as their grandparents were, or should they be encouraged to empathise with the suffragettes one term and to imagine themselves in Roman Britain the next? At another level, the question is more basic. What's the purpose of teaching history, and whose history ought schools to teach? Nicholas Tate is Chief Executive of the School Curriculum and Assessment Authority, the body with the job of advising ministers on the answers to such questions.
I see history as absolutely central to the process of cultural transmission. I mean, I see education generally as being about, to a very large extent, the passing on from one generation to another of those things which the previous generation values and holds dear. And at the centre of that is a sense of what a community thinks it is about, where it has been in the past, how it's got to where it's got to in the present, and history as story is absolutely fundamental to that. This is where one gets on to another linked purpose of history, which is, in my view, to sustain, and where it is absent, help to develop a sense of national identity on the part of all young people in our schools today. We are a more pluralistic and diverse community than we were, and therefore it's important that young people need to understand about the various strands that make up contemporary Britain. But the main strand is the development of these islands, and if people are to feel that they have a stake in this community, if they are to feel part of this national community, then I think it's very important indeed that all young people learn about the main themes of British history.
History is being recruited into the construction of a rosy and glorious past for Britain.
Stephen Ball is Professor of the Sociology of Education at King's College London.
I think one has to raise deeper questions about whether self-confidence is a useful and appropriate basis for thinking about how we operate in the world, as individuals or as nations. In some senses, the lack of a sense of humility towards the world is one of the problems that Britain has struggled with over the last 200 years, and to build into our history a simple celebration of Britain's commitment to the civilizing of the world rides roughshod over other ways of seeing Britain's impact. I mean, for example, if you take the idea of celebration in relation to the empire and Britain's role as an imperial power, that begs enormous questions and issues about, for example, the role of slavery and the creation of migrant groups within the West Indies and the United States of America and elsewhere, which now have a significant role in the politics of those countries and those arenas and the politics of the world. And to simply see or ignore the negative impact of Britain's imperial past is doing injustice to history.
But does our newfound uncertainty about the way we behaved in the days when Britain was top nation reflect historical realism or simply a lack of national self-esteem? Half a century ago, every schoolchild would have known the names of Britain's national heroes, such as Nelson and Wellington and Churchill. Who are our heroes now? Andrew Roberts has done more than his share of cutting the poor things down to size.
In ancient Greece, it was hanging a fence to be rude about a city's gods or heroes. The heroes were literally as important as the gods to the sense of national identity. And I think that we are very unsure about what we want to do with heroes in today's society. We are nervous about putting somebody on a pedestal. I think it's no surprise that we've actually waited for so long and now can't find anybody to put on the plinth in Trafalgar Square. This wasn't the case in the past.
Does this difficulty in choosing heroes reflect a lack of social consensus about the past? Or does it reflect fear of historians like you who giggle at the heroes of the immediate past?
I think it's a bit of both, and I also think that people are nervous about imposing their values, today's values, on anybody, because they know that in the future values will have changed and that they themselves might be seen to be absurd in some way. We haven't got anything like the same moral conviction that, say, the Victorians had when they could point to Admiral Nelson and say, here is a hero, let's put him on a column in the middle of London and venerate him. That sort of thing just can't go on today.
The empty plinth in Trafalgar Square says much about our lack of consensus about which aspects of our past we most admire. But isn't some of our dithering the result of our realisation that we don't all share the same heroes any more than we share a view of history? The Victorians peopled London's plinths without conducting a public opinion poll to discover who admired whom. But that would be unthinkable today. Professor Stephen Ball.
For me, the issue is who gets to be the heroes and heroines, and who gets to decide who the heroes and heroines are. It would be interesting to think about the possibility of working-class heroes, for example. And we might want to select out a group of people who might be very different from those that someone like Nick Tate might select as his heroes and heroines in history. Feminist historians have clearly given a lot of attention to this and the way in which women have been hidden in and from history, and the tendency for the emphasis to be on heroes rather than heroines.
What about Boadicea for that pedestal? A woman from Britain's indigenous people and distant enough to be almost safe from the revisionists. Or perhaps another woman from a minority race who died in England, Pocahontas. The problem with heroes and heroines is that they so often personify historical events. Would any government today, for instance, propose a statue of Oliver Cromwell just outside the Palace of Westminster? Not if its members pause to think of what Cromwell's name means in some parts of this country and in its Irish neighbour. Antonia Fraser, probably Britain's most widely read historical biographer, is an English Catholic who's written a book about Cromwell. Like so many English people, she initially approached the tales of his atrocities in Ireland with scepticism.
I was quite expecting to find it all been invented, but he did do those things. But that is what the English did to the Irish, and as a matter of fact would go on and do to the Africans in subsequent centuries. And he had to be seen in the context of his own time, when Irish people were considered lower than dogs, lower than English hunting dogs. And that was a point made by an Englishman. Now, I think unless you understand that attitude of the English, you cannot possibly understand the attitude of the Irish today. In England, he's a national hero. If you go to Huntingdon, which was his constituency, like John Major's, he's a national hero. And I made the slight tactical mistake of going from my East Anglian researches to my Irish researches without stopping and having a long, cool think. And so when I arrived in Ireland and I was sort of asking the way to Cromwell's mound at Drogheda, I had a very dusty response from a priest. And it wasn't till my companion said, "Are you crazy? This is Ireland," and went up and said, "This is Antonia Fraser, she's the daughter of the Holy Lord Longford, and she's writing about the wicked usurper Cromwell," that he said, "Oh well, the mound is that away."
The truth about the past always depends on which mound you're standing on at the time. That is especially true in Northern Ireland, where history tells not of consensus, but of division. How can one teach a coherent picture of the past to children in such a country, where history isn't just in the curriculum, but on the streets? Even now, rival versions of the terrible starvation of 1845 are daubed on the walls of Belfast. Dan McCall is a schools inspector for the Department of Education in Northern Ireland.
The famine has appeared because this is the 150th anniversary of the famine, and the famine is a very contested issue in Irish history. In Republican parts of the city, a number of wall murals have appeared. One would have images which had been recreated from the Illustrated London News of 1846, showing famine victims in emaciated condition. And to the side, there would be the statement in large capital letters, "There was no famine." Now, the message is that there was no natural famine, that the famine was artificially created. Short distance away from that particular image, there is another, which is a highly stylized representation, again, of figures taken from the Illustrated London News of 1846. It shows people, stylized bodies in graves, and this image of an emaciated woman and a child. And written across that, there is a statement that at the time this was happening, troops were firing upon people who were trying to prevent the export of corn from Ireland to Britain. Now, these are powerful images, but they don't necessarily attempt to represent the reality of the famine.
But what was that reality? Was there one reality or several? Revisionist historians are already busily reinterpreting the famine. However, what history teachers are up against in Northern Ireland is the power of history as popularly perceived. Sometimes the past acquires a life of its own. When that happens, the line between myth and historical truth becomes vanishingly small. Angus Calder is a Scottish historian with a special interest in the way ordinary people recall past events.
The historian's job is to establish truth. The question then arises, what is truth? What is the special kind of truth which the historian can establish? I think what the historian has to do is to surge or scramble past accumulated mythologies, so that Bonnie Prince Charlie is a Scottish nationalist, which is absolute rubbish. What he wanted to do was become King of England. But you force your way past these incrustated myths, on the basis of which new myths can be created.
You distinguish between myth and history, but is there really a distinction, and how would you define it?
I think there is really no distinction between myth and history. The first historical works in the West are the Bible and Homer. They're mythical, they're history. That's the first written history. Given the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is myth and history. It involves the myth of the Roman Empire and the history of the Roman Empire. And I don't see how one can separate the two very easily.
But it's surely dangerous if one can't separate them, and especially dangerous if people don't want to separate them. For a myth may shape events far more powerfully than a scrupulous historical account, full of balance and uncertainty. Some myths are harmless, merely a sort of historical fairy story. Think of King Arthur's failure to attend to the cakes. Others are moral tales. Remember Robert the Bruce learning perseverance from a spider. But in divided communities, such as Northern Ireland, mythical images represent a truth more powerful than any historical reality. In the lands that were once Yugoslavia, old parables of ethnic loathing remain as fresh and vivid as the morning's newspaper stories. Neil Asherson is a journalist and historian who's travelled widely in these countries. What has happened to historical truth as they've fallen apart?
As communities break up, so, for example, Serbian memories of what the Croats did, or what the Croats are also said to have done, surface. And indeed they surface with such intensity in many of these communities that people will, it almost gets to the point of hallucination, so that images which are very familiar, images which were, for example, being told to the Irish journalist Hubert Butler in the years immediately after the war, the image of the great river, and down it comes, first of all, the bride still holding her bouquet in her white dress with her throat slit, and then behind her, floating slowly, the bridegroom, and then all the wedding guests, one after another, their hands tied behind their back, their throat slit, come past down the river. And he talked to people who said, I saw it, I saw that. That's what the Ustasha did during the occupation to us Serbs, you see. This appeared, people began to see, floating down the Drina, the same thing in the last 3 or 4 years. And that is Serbian use of history to justify the breakup of communities, you know. And you can't say somebody deliberately made this up. People just are deeply suggestible to the history which they carry inside themselves.
History in this contorted form is clearly a lethal weapon. Can other history be used to blunt its force? Are there any ways in which the analysis of the past can bring rationality and empathy to civil conflict? History teachers take their lives in their hands if they try to be dispassionate in such communities. But does Dan McCall believe that the teaching of history, appropriately handled, can heal past wounds?
We have been advised, we have been encouraged, we've been exhorted, up to the outbreak of the war in Yugoslavia, to put before children in Northern Ireland the example of Europe, post-World War II Europe, how old wounds had been healed since 1945, and how Northern Ireland and its problems appeared so out of tune with the times, a continuation of old, bitter arguments dating back to the 17th century. I think what happened in Yugoslavia, the dismemberment of that state and ethnic cleansing, they I think highlight the dangers that we have. We're in a divided society where both communities have suffered from a long period of on-off violence, where paramilitary groups have much power, where people take refuge in half-understood and prejudiced views of the past, where their nationalism is closed down, exclusive and narrow, where they feel threatened, and where people are willing at times to kill to defend their points of view. Now, if you think in those circumstances, teachers have very little room to manoeuvre. They must avoid the charge of social engineering. We cannot expect the impossible. We can't expect that direct and fair attention be given to contested issues. And we can hope, I think, that young people will not accept uncritically the history of the streets or where it exists, the historically limited views of family and peer groups. But they cannot, and they should not be made responsible, I think, for resolving with children the accumulated problems of centuries.
Of course it's wrong for a teacher to invent historical harmony where none existed. But what about history teachers who find themselves required to teach what they feel is a dishonest version of the past? What then is their responsibility? Under communism, East Germany's history teachers faced that dilemma. They were required to give their pupils a view that was simple, coherent and false. Hilda Roma-Stanner comes from Western Germany, but she now works in the Ministry of Education in one of the Eastern German states.
You had the Marxism-Leninism as the ideology. And this theory, it knows what is right and what is wrong, and it knows the sense of history and the purpose of history. And the teachers had it in some way not very difficult because everything was prescribed. They had textbooks that lined out exactly the aims of the lessons, what to say, even what you had to write on the board. And now the teachers are in a very bad situation because they lost their authority. They lost it in several ways. Before they had a very strong position and they always were right, and now their role changed and sometimes they feel very worthless. Because when pupils ask that question, what did you do in the last 40 years? They cannot answer the truth. But I think, and this is a very interesting thing, teachers and pupils played also in the last 40 years a special role. The roles were pupils don't ask very critical questions, and teachers didn't force pupils too much. And so it was a role game that nobody hurts the other. And I have the feeling this role game continues up to now.
The role playing in the classrooms of Eastern Germany is a sign of a profound problem. Every country needs a collective view of its past that it can live with. East and West Germany have both had to come to terms with Germany's part in the Second World War. Schools in Western Germany did so by teaching children to ask whether they would have had the courage to stand up and be counted, and pointing out the relevance to protecting Germany's new immigrants from racism. But schools in Eastern Germany simply lied to children for over 40 years. When teachers themselves didn't stand up to communism, it's difficult for them to discuss civil responsibility in the context of the Second World War. The trouble is, if a nation isn't confident about its past, it can hardly be confident about its present. This is the dilemma that faces Maitland-Stobart and the Council of Europe, which is trying to help the disoriented countries of Central and Eastern Europe to find a past that they can live with. What can national history do for these fractured countries?
History is seen, I suppose, as a form of social glue, of cement to give the nation a body. But of course one of the big problems is that in Central and Eastern Europe we're living with considerable cultural diversity, and then we have the difficulty of what sort of national history do we teach? And there are different ways of teaching national history, and we're very worried that national history should not become nationalistic history. National history is legitimate. It can be taught in an open way, in an inclusive way, reflecting the diversity of the various groups in the community, but it can be taught in an exclusive way as the history of the majority, excluding the minorities. And as we know, the situation concerning minorities in Central and Eastern Europe is explosive.
But is it really possible to steer a line between national pride and nationalism? In looking for an account of their origins, many countries find it easier to think of themselves as a tribe than as a nation, and to define themselves in terms of their past enemies rather than of their present citizens. In Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, where a country's history has so often been obliterated by a conqueror, the past which has survived has often been a romantic legend rather than a rational account. Neil Asherson.
Memory is, of course, the great tool from which your account of your own origins comes, and they remember what they were told. In the case of the Baltic states, it's two things. It's real folk memory of old myths of origin and of ancient religions and pagan religion, particularly in the case of Lithuania. But with that is mixed memories of the first written histories, 19th to 20th century histories of these countries. And so people just committed to memory and told it to their children. as peoples in that situation always have done. I mean, Polish history was forbidden in the 19th century, and there was a point, rather like a kind of puberty ritual, in which a child was taken, always, interestingly enough, always by a mother, and shown the chest was open, and the shirt was brought out with the blood on it, and the hole. This is where your grandfather was shot. We kept his shirt. This is his sword, who he used in the insurrection in 1831. This is this, this is that. So it was always done. It was committed to memory and passed on in this way.
Such memories have enormous power to hold a people together. Indeed, something of the romantic myth is clearly essential to give a country a sense of cohesion and purpose. For such a myth to be effective, it doesn't need to be tribal or ethnic or about past persecutions or sufferings. But all countries, surely, need to think of their nation's history as something unifying their citizens rather than differentiating them. Raphael Samuel.
One of the great themes of the national idea is the idea of the lost unity, of recovering a lost unity. So an idealized lost past is absolutely central to, at the risk of being dogmatic, I would say all national mythologies. The idea of a pre-lapsarian state in which once all people lived together as brothers, in which there was a oneness about the country. That's a tremendously powerful myth. And what a national movement is about is to kind of restore that lost oneness.
You can't really have nationalism without some account of how we came to be.
Neil Acheson.
Because if nationalism is, and in a way it is, as Benedict Anderson called it, an imagined community, you have to imagine that people you've never met and never will meet have the same culture as you and think in the same way and speak in the same way in many respects. And that also means that somehow you all had to begin in the same way. And then there has to be an account of it which is convincing and this binds nation together. I mean, even a kind of non-ethnic nationalism, like, let's say, the United States. I mean, they have to have a myth of origin. They have a myth of origin which is about degenerate redcoats and upper-class Brits, which you can still see spewing out of movies, whether it's Pocahontas or Braveheart or whatever it is. And they have a myth of origin too. So without an account of how a nation came to be, it's very difficult to imagine a nation emerging and succeeding. When you come to the question of whether it matters that the history is true or not, this is, of course, the crucial question to me. It clearly doesn't matter from the point of view of effectiveness. And many nations are founded on quite nonsensical versions of their own past. Let's take England. For many years, it was taught as a kind of article of English, I would say English rather than British nationalism, although it was supposed to account for Britain as well, that Britain was a kind of genetic composite of Saxon honesty, which had provided the basic spirit of tolerance and patience, and the Norman genius for construction of institutions and energy, and that these things somehow fused into a single amalgam. And this, of course, is the utmost nonsense. I mean, in some ways, of course, the reverse of the historical truth as we now know it, which is that Anglo-Saxon England was immensely developed, extraordinary society, far more sophisticated and advanced, of course, than anything the Normans had. The Normans were only able to do something like Domesday Book by using Anglo-Saxon literacy, research, and organisation, which they took over and then claimed the credit for. So there are many examples, not so far afield, of lying about one's own history, honestly or dishonestly.
Lying about one's own history isn't necessarily dangerous. In Britain, we tend to characterise ourselves as a mongrel race, good at absorbing immigrants from many different cultures. By congratulating ourselves on absorbing Vikings, Normans and Huguenots, we may foster a friendlier attitude to today's immigrants. America's view of itself as a melting pot has undoubtedly encouraged a sense that foreigners should be welcomed and tolerated. But how far is it proper to distort history in order to cement communities? One school of thought argues for rewriting the past to make sure that it tells the story of women and other underrepresented groups. Others see such rewriting as a travesty, putting far too much weight on inadequate evidence. It is, after all, those dead white males who produced most historical records. Margaret Jacob is Professor of History at the New School for Social Research in Manhattan. Does she think that history ought therefore to belong to those DWMs?
History is not what happened in the past. History is what we can know to have happened in the past. So we are, all of us, utterly dependent upon the records that have been left from the past in order to construct it. Now, it is just not the case that women, for example, left few records. It may be the case they left fewer records than men, or they left fewer records than, say, government bureaucracies that were always wonderful at keeping records. But the reality is that if you go into the libraries and archives and say to yourself, well, I think it would be interesting to know what women thought and did in 18th century England, for example, what you find is a wealth of information and material. But unless you ask the question, you wouldn't find it.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right question to ask. The lives of women undoubtedly played a smaller part in shaping political events in past centuries than they do today. Those who want to bring women or ethnic minorities into the foreground of history do so only by applying today's standards to yesterday's events. Does Raphael Samuel regard such minority history as legitimate?
The idea of minority history is one that should be looked at quite warily. For example, I'm passionately in favour of ways of making the history of the British Empire absolutely integral to the teaching of British history for the last 4 centuries. I don't actually believe that you necessarily do that most effectively by writing about the history of the relatively small number of blacks in 19th century England. Or looking to what happened to the slaves who were freed under Lord Mansfield's judgment. I mean, it's an interesting exercise, but it seems to me if you want to bring empire home to children, say, in a group of Northamptonshire schools, you might do that far more effectively by looking at the British diaspora, by looking at how people went up from a group of villages to the northwest frontier as missionaries in Africa, as traders in Ceylon, as planters in Malaya, as settlers in Kenya, as convicts in Australia. I mean, by looking at the whole nation and the whole culture, you would understand better the nature of imperialism. Similarly, I'm very much against thinking of women's history as being the addition of a neglected minority. The point of women's history would be that it might make issues of sexuality, the family and the home as central to history as it is in life. So it's not a matter of giving an honorary minority status to a previously neglected group, but of using that group's excluded experience to transform our sense of how the majority live.
On the face of it, this raises one of the most basic questions of all. Ought history to be the story of public events, of treaties and wars and politicians, or should it be the tale of ordinary people and the way their lives have changed? Traditionally, public events have been assumed to matter most, but as history is increasingly expected to encourage a sense of inclusiveness, the emphasis has shifted to the lives of ordinary folk. In fact, the shift of emphasis may be merely one more example of the prism through which our view of the past continuously passes. The historical perspective of each age reflects its current concerns. So where once, in the late 19th century, children were taught to draw plans of battlefields, now they're encouraged to think about the suffragettes and the poor laws and the abolition of slavery. Ought historians to welcome the change? Margaret Jacob.
There's no doubt in our minds that history today, as it is taught, is very different from what it was in the 1960s. When I went to high school and college, every autumn you used to start with the Puritans. There was something led up to Thanksgiving, maybe, I don't know. Now, every autumn, you start American history with the indigenous peoples who were here, what they were like, how their tribal structures worked, and so forth. And then you move to the Puritans. You still get Thanksgiving in, but you get it in now with its, I think, a richer, more complex picture. Social history, a more inclusive history, is now very much part of everyday classroom discussions. Will this have a healing effect? I think we would hope so. We would hope that it makes people more understanding, to know something about other peoples. It is believed that a democracy will flourish more readily if that kind of empathy and if a sense of diversity is instilled early on in the student. We have always seen education to be about the inculcation of civic virtue.
The idea that studying history can inculcate civic virtue would have been familiar to the Victorians, and one which they would thoroughly have approved of. It is surely the best reason for learning any subject. But it may be easier to learn civic virtue from studying the past in the United States, where the tale is of a successful nation based on tolerance and the rule of law, which has lived at peace for most of its 200 years. What lessons can one learn from Europe's blood-spattered history? Maitland Stobbart of the Council of Europe.
If history is well taught, first of all, history shouldn't just be seen, as it often is, as learning masses and masses of facts. Just teaching about something isn't going to make people more tolerant, more critical, more democratic. There must be facts, but there must also be the acquisition of skills, critical thinking skills, handling evidence, expressing oneself clearly, listening to others, being able to present a reasoned argument, the ability to resist propaganda, and it also, and I think is very important, it also involves attitudes, the development of attitudes which I think are essential for a democratic society. Compassion, open-mindedness, curiosity, and I think one quality which I think most of our societies will need is civil courage. I become very uncomfortable when people talk about using history, because there are people who want to create the good citizen, and the good citizen is the obedient citizen, perhaps, or the good citizen of Europe, and that's somebody who loves the European institutions and doesn't criticise them.
But there's the rub. How to create citizens who are proud of their country, but not too proud to admit that it's sometimes gone astray, and to speak up against injustice, past and present. In striking this delicate balance between patriotism and honesty, between nationalism and national pride, does Andrew Roberts think that European history is a helpful model?
I think as the history of Europe over the last 1,000 years has been that of constant war and battle, struggle, religious upheaval and violence, it seems extraordinary to concentrate on history as something that is likely to bring people together. I would have thought that people ought to concentrate much more on culture and on other aspects of European endeavour than history, which has been one long bloodbath.
Perhaps the best use for European history is to illustrate how not to run a continent. If we understand the past, we may be a little less likely to be condemned to repeat it. More important, if we understand our fellow human beings a little better, we may be more willing to live at peace with them. Even in Northern Ireland, as Dan McCall has found, history teaching can make a pitch for peace.
Thinking of one particular incident when an issue dealing with the late 16th century in Northern Ireland was explored. It concerned a massacre in 1575. It's a controversial episode in Irish history. This teacher worked hard to show his pupils how it happened, to try to put it into the context of the time, not to look at it through rosy glasses from the late 20th century. And he succeeded to a very large degree in that the young people were aware of all the issues. Now, they weren't at the end of it all in a position to say who was right, who was wrong, to say yay or nay to particular questions. One girl coming through that said, and it's a Northern Ireland expression, that, and I quote, "that history has got my head turned." And that, I think, is a positive thing, because there is one child who has been taken through, she's a 14-year-old, who's been taken through a programme where the old certainties were challenged.
History can turn people's heads, and that illustrates both its dangers and its opportunities. Politicians have used it all too often to aggravate conflicts. If history serves merely to keep alive hatreds that began with, say, a 16th century massacre, we'd be better off without it. Nor is it worth recalling the past if nations can live with history only by falsifying it. But if history can be taught in ways that allow people to accept that there are many interpretations of the past, then some of the more dangerous certainties may start to crumble. Indeed, that may be the best that we can hope for. Ideally, the study of history should encourage people to combine national pride and mutual tolerance. But sadly, humanity has rarely achieved that combination in the past. It may therefore be more than even the most enlightened education policy can ever hope to deliver.
Analysis was presented by Frances Cairncross of The Economist and was an independent production by Susan Marling of Just Radio. The editor is Nicola Merrick.